My name is Mary, and I was 31 years old when I discovered that some forms of evil can only be answered with the same violence they have sown, that justice sometimes requires the righteous to become instruments of divine wrath, and that even the house of God can become the stage for retribution that has been too long delayed. The year was 1856, and I had spent 23 years as human property on the Boudreaux plantation in the humid bayou country of Louisiana, where the Spanish moss hung from ancient oaks like funeral shrouds, and the very air seemed heavy with the accumulated suffering of generations of slaves. Master Henry Boudreaux owned 5,000 acres of sugarcane land stretching along the Mississippi River, worked by 437 human beings who existed solely to transform raw cane into the sweet crystals that funded the luxurious lifestyle of a Creole family that traced its wealth back to the earliest days of French colonial exploitation. The plantation house rose from the Louisiana landscape like a monument to human greed, its white columns gleaming with profits extracted from black bodies that had been broken on the altar of white prosperity. But it was not Master Boudreaux himself who had transformed my existence from mere bondage into something approaching hell on earth. That distinction belonged to his wife, Madame Celeste Boudreaux, a woman whose beauty concealed cruelties that would have impressed the devil himself, whose cultured voice could speak words that cut deeper than any whip, whose delicate hands had inflicted suffering that left scars on souls as well as flesh. As Madame Celeste was 35 years old, descended from French aristocracy that had fled to Louisiana during the revolution that had cost their relatives their heads, carrying with them traditions of refined brutality that they had adapted to the peculiar institution of slavery, with creativity that spoke of generations spent perfecting the art of human domination. She possessed the kind of beauty that made men stumble over their words, and women hate themselves by comparison, with dark hair that caught sunlight like silk, and eyes the color of emeralds that revealed no warmth whatsoever. But beneath that perfect exterior lived something that was far from human, a creature that fed on the pain of those who had no power to resist her whims. Madame Celeste had elevated the torment of slave women to a science, studying our weaknesses with the attention of a scholar researching ancient texts, cataloging our fears and vulnerabilities so she could exploit them with surgical precision whenever the mood struck her fancy. I had been chosen as her personal lady's maid when I turned 16, selected not for any particular skill or beauty, but because she had recognized in me a spirit that had not yet been completely broken by 15 years of bondage. Madame Celeste preferred to work with slaves who still possessed some trace of dignity, finding greater pleasure in destroying something that retained value than in tormenting those who had already been reduced to empty shells. "You have intelligent eyes, Mary," she had said on the day I was brought from the field quarters to begin my service in the big house. "I can see thoughts moving behind them, dreams that you haven't shared with anyone. We're going to become very close, you and I. I'm going to teach you things about yourself that you never suspected." The lessons that followed were masterpieces of psychological torture, designed to strip away every fragment of self-respect and human dignity that 15 years of slavery had left intact. Madame Celeste possessed an almost supernatural ability to identify what each slave valued most, and then she would systematically destroy it with methods that left no physical marks but created wounds that never healed. She began by taking away my name, declaring that Mary was too common for someone who served in such an elevated position. I was renamed Désirée, a French word that she claimed better suited someone whose primary function was to fulfill her mistress's desires regardless of personal cost. But the new name was not a gift. It was a chain that bound me to her will more completely than any iron shackles ever could. "Désirée means desired one, she explained, as I helped her dress for one of the elaborate social gatherings that filled the Boudreaux calendar. "You are desired by me, for my purposes, according to my wishes. Your old name belonged to the girl who worked in the fields. Your new name belongs to the woman who will serve me in ways that field hands could never understand." The service she required went far beyond the typical duties of a lady's maid, extending into territories that violated both body and soul with equal brutality. I was required to witness her intimate moments with various men, both her husband and the lovers she entertained while he traveled on plantation business. But witnessing was only the beginning. She demanded that I participate in scenarios that transformed me from servant into unwilling accomplice in activities that defiled everything I had once considered sacred. "You're shocked," she said, after forcing me to assist in one particularly degrading encounter with a visiting French diplomat. But shock is just another form of innocence, and innocence is a luxury that slaves cannot afford. "I'm teaching you about the real world, about the relationship between power and pleasure, about what it means to truly serve someone who owns not just your body, but your soul." The worst torments were those that involved other slaves, scenarios where Madame Celeste would force me to choose which of my fellow bondsmen would receive punishment for imaginary infractions, or to participate in humiliations that destroyed relationships I had built with other members of the plantation community. She understood that isolation was the most effective method of breaking resistant spirits, and she used my position as her personal maid to cut me off from every source of comfort and human connection. But the cruelty that finally pushed me beyond the boundaries of endurance involved my daughter Rose, the 8-year-old child who had been born during my 3rd year of service in the big house. Rose was the product of one of Madame Celeste's lessons, conceived during an encounter that had been designed to teach me about submission and the futility of resistance to my mistress's will. Rose's father was a visiting French merchant whom Madame Celeste had entertained while forcing me to participate in activities that left me pregnant with a child who would serve as a permanent reminder of my degradation. But instead of viewing Rose as an unwanted burden, I had found in her the one source of joy that survived in my broken world, the single reason to continue existing in circumstances that would have driven a weaker person to suicide. Madame Celeste had initially seemed indifferent to Rose's existence, allowing her to live in the servants' quarters while showing no interest in her development or welfare. But as the child grew and began to display the intelligence and beauty that she had inherited from both parents, my mistress's attention turned toward her with an interest that filled me with dread. "She's quite lovely, isn't she?" Madame Celeste observed one morning as Rose played in the garden outside the big house, her light skin and European features making her appear almost white in the Louisiana sunlight. Such unusual coloring, such refined bone structure. She could pass for white in many circumstances, couldn't she? The comment sent chills through my heart because I understood the implications of what my mistress was considering. Mixed-race children who could pass for white represented special opportunities for the kinds of activities that Madame Celeste found most entertaining, and Rose's beauty made her particularly valuable for purposes that I couldn't bear to contemplate. "She's just a child," I said, the words slipping out before I could stop myself from making the mistake of showing concern for something that my mistress might choose to target. "All the more interesting," Madame Celeste replied, her emerald eyes gleaming with anticipation of pleasures that I had learned to recognize and dread. Children are so malleable, so easily shaped according to their teachers' preferences. Rose could become quite useful as she develops, don't you think? The threat was clear enough to freeze my blood, but veiled sufficiently to avoid crossing lines that even Madame Celeste recognized as dangerous to cross too openly. She was planning to use my daughter for the same purposes that she had used me, to transform an innocent child into an unwilling participant in activities that would destroy her soul along with her body. I began watching Rose more carefully, looking for signs that Madame Celeste had begun implementing whatever plans she was developing for my daughter's future. The attention came gradually, small kindnesses and special treats that seemed innocent to casual observers, but which I recognized as the beginning of a grooming process designed to make Rose more compliant when the real training began. "Your mama works so hard for me," Madame Celeste would say as she offered Rose sweets from her private supplies. "Don't you think she deserves to have a daughter who is equally dedicated to serving the family that provides for both of you?" Rose was too young to understand the implications of these conversations, but I could see her beginning to respond to the attention and affection that Madame Celeste was showering upon her. My daughter was being prepared for a fate that I had experienced firsthand, transformed into willing victim through kindness that would eventually be withdrawn and replaced with demands that no child should ever have to fulfill. The realization that I could not protect Rose from the same degradation that had defined my own existence for 15 years created a desperation in my heart that transcended every instinct for survival and self-preservation. I had endured my own suffering, because endurance was the only option available to someone who possessed no power to resist. But watching my daughter being groomed for similar treatment awakened something in my soul that I had thought was long dead. I began to plan Madame Celeste's death with the same attention to detail that she had devoted to planning my psychological destruction, studying her routines and vulnerabilities while considering methods that would ensure both success and appropriate justice for 15 years of accumulated cruelties. The woman who had elevated the torment of slaves to an art form would discover what it felt like to be helpless in the hands of someone who possessed absolute power over her life and death. The opportunity would come during Sunday Mass at St. Augustine's Catholic Church, the weekly ritual where the Boudreau family displayed their piety while surrounded by the human property that made their devotions possible. Every Sunday, Madame Celeste knelt before the altar and prayed for forgiveness of sins that she had no intention of abandoning, while I stood behind her with the other house slaves and planned her journey to whatever judgment awaited those who had perverted their earthly power into instruments of human torture. The knife I had chosen was a thing of beauty, Spanish steel, that I had taken from Madame Celeste's own sewing kit, sharpened until it could slide through silk or flesh with equal ease. It was fitting that she would die by an instrument that she had used for creating the delicate embroidery that decorated her gowns, transformed from a tool of creation into an implement of divine justice. I was 31 years old, and I had learned everything there was to know about cruelty and power, about the relationship between the strong and the weak, about the price that evil eventually pays when it encounters someone who has nothing left to lose. Madame Celeste had taught me these lessons through 15 years of systematic torture, and soon I would demonstrate how well I had absorbed her instruction. The bells of St. Augustine's would ring across the Louisiana Bayou country, calling the faithful to worship while summoning the instruments of divine retribution to their appointed task. In the house of God, where Madame Celeste knelt in pretended devotion while planning fresh torments for those she owned, justice would finally be served with the steel that she herself had provided for the purpose. The autumn of 1856 brought with it an intensification of Madame Celeste's interest in my daughter Rose, and with that interest came a systematic campaign to transform an innocent 8-year-old child into a willing participant in activities that would destroy her soul before she was old enough to understand what was being stolen from her. I watched this corruption begin with the helpless desperation of a mother who possessed no legal power to protect her child from the woman who owned them both like livestock. The grooming process was subtle and expertly executed, beginning with small privileges that set Rose apart from the other slave children on the plantation. Special meals from the master's kitchen, pretty dresses that Madame Celeste claimed were cast-offs from her own wardrobe, toys and books that gradually isolated my daughter from her peers while making her increasingly dependent on my mistress's approval and affection. Rose is such a bright child, Madame Celeste would say during the morning ritual of dressing her hair and selecting her gowns for the day's activities. She deserves opportunities that other slave children will never receive, don't you think? Education, refinement, exposure to the finer things that make life worth living. But I recognized these seemingly generous gestures as the first stage of a process that I had experienced firsthand during my own transition from field hand to personal servant. Madame Celeste was creating emotional bonds that would make Rose eager to please, establishing patterns of reward and punishment that would eventually be used to coerce compliance with demands that no child should ever have to fulfill. The educational component of Rose's preparation was particularly insidious, designed to provide her with knowledge and skills that would make her more valuable for the specialized services that Madame Celeste had in mind. Reading lessons conducted in French as well as English, instruction in music and dancing that emphasized grace and sensuality, art classes that focused on the human form with attention to details that seemed inappropriate for someone of Rose's age. Beauty is fleeting, Madame Celeste explained to Rose during one of these artistic sessions, but knowledge of how to use beauty effectively can last a lifetime. I'm teaching you secrets that most women never learn, skills that will make you indispensable to those who recognize your true value. I was forced to witness these lessons while maintaining the facade of gratitude that my mistress expected from someone whose child was receiving such special attention, but every moment of instruction felt like watching my daughter being led step by step toward the same degradation that had defined my own existence for 15 years. The physical preparation was even more disturbing, involving examinations and treatments that Madame Celeste claimed were necessary for maintaining Rose's health and appearance. These medical sessions were conducted in the privacy of my mistress's chambers, with only myself present as witness to procedures that seemed designed more for evaluation than treatment. "Such lovely bone structure," Madame Celeste would murmur, as she studied Rose's developing body with the calculating attention of someone assessing valuable merchandise. "And her skin is perfect, not too dark, but with just enough color to make her exotic to the right clientele." The word clientele sent chills through my heart, because it revealed the commercial nature of whatever plans my mistress was developing for Rose's future. My daughter was being prepared not just for personal service, but for activities that would involve other people, men who would pay for access to a child who combined beauty with the vulnerability that Madame Celeste's customers seemed to prefer. I began to understand that Rose's mixed-race heritage made her particularly valuable for the kinds of services that my mistress specialized in providing. Men who might hesitate to abuse a purely white child could justify their desires when the victim possessed African blood that legally classified her as property rather than person. The combination of Rose's light skin and slave status created opportunities that Madame Celeste intended to exploit for both profit and personal satisfaction. The networking component of Rose's preparation involved introducing her to the social circles that frequented the Boudreaux plantation for business and pleasure. These gatherings were presented as opportunities for cultural enrichment, chances for a slave child to observe the refined behavior of her betters while learning proper deportment and social skills. But I recognized these events as auditions, opportunities for potential customers to evaluate Rose's suitability for their particular preferences. The men who attended these gatherings paid special attention to my daughter, commenting on her development and potential in terms that would have been inappropriate if applied to a free child, but which were considered acceptable when discussing valuable plantation property. "She'll be quite something in a few years," observed Monsieur Thibodeau, a wealthy sugar planter whose own reputation for exotic tastes was well known throughout Louisiana society. "That combination of innocence and availability is rare enough to command premium prices from discriminating customers." "Patience, mon ami," Madame Celeste replied with the knowing smile of someone who had spent years perfecting her craft. "The finest wines must be aged properly before they reach their full potential. Rose is still developing, but when she's ready, she'll exceed your highest expectations." These conversations took place in my presence, because Madame Celeste wanted me to understand exactly what was planned for my daughter's future, wanted me to experience the helpless despair of watching Rose being prepared for the same fate that had destroyed my own innocence 15 years earlier. My mistress fed on this particular form of psychological torture, finding pleasure in forcing mothers to witness the corruption of their children while being powerless to prevent it. The timeline for Rose's transition from child to commodity became clearer as autumn progressed toward winter. Madame Celeste spoke of Rose's debut as something planned for her 12th birthday, still 3 years in the future, but close enough to require serious preparation. This debut would mark her official availability for the specialized services that commanded the highest prices in Louisiana's underground economy. 12 is the perfect age, my mistress explained during one of our private conversations in her chambers. Old enough to understand what's required of her, but young enough to still possess the innocence that our customers value so highly. Too much younger, and even our most adventurous clients become squeamish. Too much older, and she loses the freshness that justifies premium pricing. The casual way she discussed my daughter's planned exploitation made my blood boil with rage that I had to carefully conceal behind the mask of submission that had kept me alive for 15 years. But beneath that mask I was planning Madame Celeste's death with the same methodical attention to detail that she was devoting to Rose's corruption. I began studying my mistress's routines and vulnerabilities with the focus of a hunter stalking dangerous prey. Her daily schedule was predictable enough to allow for careful planning, but varied enough to provide multiple opportunities for someone patient enough to wait for the perfect moment to strike. The Sunday Mass routine was particularly promising because it involved the entire Boudreaux family traveling to St. Augustine's Catholic Church in New Orleans, a journey that required careful coordination and provided multiple points where violence might be applied without immediate discovery. The church itself was crowded enough to provide concealment while being sacred enough to add symbolic weight to whatever justice might be administered there. But more importantly, Sunday Mass represented the height of Madame Celeste's hypocrisy, the weekly ritual where she knelt before God and pretended piety while planning cruelties that would have horrified the devil himself. It was fitting that her judgment should come in the house of God, surrounded by the religious symbols that she had perverted through her systematic destruction of innocent souls. I began carrying the Spanish steel blade that I had taken from her sewing kit, keeping it concealed in the folds of my dress while I went about the daily routines that had defined my existence for 15 years. The knife became my constant companion, a reminder that Rose's future could still be changed through decisive action that would eliminate the source of her planned degradation. The blade was beautiful in its simplicity, perfectly balanced and sharp enough to slide through flesh without resistance. It had been created for delicate work, but it would serve equally well for the rough justice that Madame Celeste had earned through 15 years of systematic cruelty. As December approached and Rose's 9th birthday drew near, the preparations for her eventual debut intensified with lessons and examinations that made my mistress's intentions increasingly obvious. But these activities also provided opportunities to study the routines and security measures that surrounded Madame Celeste's daily existence. She was most vulnerable during the moments of religious observance, when she focused entirely on maintaining her facade of Christian devotion, kneeling in prayer while surrounded by slaves who were expected to stand silently behind her in positions of humble service. These moments of pretended piety created perfect opportunities for someone positioned close enough to reach her with steel that could end her existence before anyone realized what was happening. I was 31 years old, and I had learned everything there was to know about patience and planning, about waiting for the perfect moment to strike at enemies who considered themselves untouchable. Madame Celeste had provided excellent instruction in these subjects through 15 years of systematic torture, and soon I would demonstrate the practical application of her lessons. The bells of St. Augustine's Catholic Church would ring across New Orleans, calling the faithful to worship, while summoning divine justice to its appointed task. In the house of God, where my mistress knelt in false devotion while planning the corruption of innocent children, the Spanish steel that she had provided would finally serve the purpose for which God had truly intended it. Rose's future would be secured through violence that was both necessary and righteous, while Madame Celeste would discover what it felt like to be helpless in the hands of someone who possessed absolute power over her life and death. The woman who had elevated the torment of slaves to an art form would become the masterpiece of her own instruction, painted in blood that would consecrate the church floor with justice too long delayed. The winter of 1856 brought with it a sense of approaching destiny that seemed to permeate the very atmosphere of the Boudreaux plantation, as if the Louisiana bayou itself could sense that events were building toward a climax that would transform the ordered world of master and slave into something far more dangerous and unpredictable. Rose's 9th birthday had passed in November, with celebrations that highlighted Madame Celeste's accelerating plans for my daughter's future, making the timeline of corruption increasingly urgent and the need for decisive action undeniable. The birthday party itself had been a masterpiece of psychological manipulation, designed to reinforce Rose's sense of specialness while introducing her to concepts and activities that would prepare her for the services she would be expected to provide in 3 years' time. The guests included several of Madame Celeste's regular clients, men whose interest in my daughter was becoming increasingly obvious despite the veneer of respectability that surrounded their interactions. "Such a lovely child," Monsieur Broussard had commented, while watching Rose demonstrate the dancing skills that Madame Celeste had been teaching her. "She moves with natural grace, almost as if she were born for performance." "All the best performers begin their training early," my mistress had replied, her emerald eyes gleaming with satisfaction at Rose's developing abilities. "By the time she reaches maturity, she'll be capable of entertaining the most discriminating audiences." The double meanings in these conversations were becoming less subtle as Rose's debut approached, creating an atmosphere of anticipation that made my stomach churn with revulsion and my heart pound with determination to prevent the fate that my mistress had planned. Every day brought new lessons and preparations that moved my daughter closer to the degradation that had defined my own existence for 15 years. But the birthday celebration had also provided valuable intelligence about the security arrangements and routine procedures that surrounded Madame Celeste's daily existence. I had observed her interactions with various guests, noting the moments when her attention was completely focused on social obligations that made her vulnerable to someone positioned close enough to strike with the Spanish steel blade that had become my constant companion. The Sunday Mass routine at St. Augustine's Catholic Church had evolved into my preferred scenario for delivering the justice that Madame Celeste had earned through 15 years of systematic cruelty. The weekly journey to New Orleans provided multiple opportunities for action, while the church itself offered symbolic appropriateness for an act of divine retribution that would balance scales weighted too long against the innocent. I had spent months studying the layout of St. Augustine's, memorizing every detail of the sanctuary where the Boudreaux family displayed their piety while surrounded by the human property that made such demonstrations possible. The pews were arranged to provide clear sightlines from the slave section to the front rows where the plantation aristocracy knelt in pretended devotion, while the acoustics of the building would carry any sounds of disturbance throughout the sacred space. Most importantly, the positioning of the household staff during Mass placed me directly behind Madame Celeste's usual seat, close enough to reach her with the blade that rested concealed in the folds of my dress. The moment of communion provided the perfect opportunity when my mistress would be kneeling in prayer with her head bowed in submission to divine authority that she had spent her lifetime defying through systematic destruction of innocent souls. The irony was perfect in its symbolic completeness. The woman who had perverted her earthly power into instruments of human torture would receive her judgment in the house of God, killed with steel that she herself had provided while pretending devotion to a deity whose commandments she had violated in every conceivable way. But before I could implement the plan that had been developing in my mind for months, Madame Celeste herself provided the final provocation that transformed calculated justice into personal necessity. The incident occurred during the second week of December, when Rose's latest examination revealed developments that my mistress found particularly encouraging for her long-term plans. "She's developing quite nicely," Madame Celeste observed, as she studied my daughter's 9-year-old body with the calculating attention of someone evaluating valuable merchandise. "Her proportions are becoming more interesting, and her responses to certain stimuli suggest that she'll be naturally receptive to the kind of training we'll begin implementing soon." The clinical language could not disguise the horrific implications of what my mistress was describing. Rose was being evaluated like livestock, assessed for her potential value in activities that would destroy her childhood innocence while generating profits for the woman who owned her like property. "I think we should accelerate the timeline," Madame Celeste continued, her voice carrying the excitement of someone who had discovered unexpected opportunities for profit and pleasure. "Instead of waiting until her 12th birthday, we might consider beginning her practical education during her 10th year. There's considerable demand for younger subjects among certain clientele." The casual way she discussed advancing my daughter's corruption by 2 full years sent waves of rage through my system that threatened to overwhelm the careful control I had maintained for 15 years. Rose was barely 9 years old, still playing with dolls and dreaming of fairy tales, and this monster was planning to transform her into a commodity for the entertainment of men whose desires focused on children. "The younger they are when training begins," my mistress explained, "the more completely they can be shaped according to customer preferences. Rose still possesses the malleability that makes total transformation possible, but that window of opportunity closes quickly as children develop independent thoughts and moral resistance." That night, lying on my straw mattress in the servants' quarters while listening to Rose's innocent breathing from the pallet beside mine, I made the final decision that would transform months of planning into immediate action. The Spanish steel blade rested beneath my pillow like a promise of justice, sharp enough to end Madame Celeste's existence, while ensuring that my daughter would never experience the degradation that had defined my own life. The December 17th Sunday Mass at St. Augustine's Catholic Church would be Madame Celeste's last performance of piety, her final opportunity to kneel before God and pretend devotion while planning cruelties that would horrify the angels themselves. The woman who had elevated human suffering to an art form would discover what it felt like to be helpless in the hands of someone who possessed absolute power over her life and death. I spent the final days before the appointed Sunday in careful preparation, ensuring that every detail of my plan had been considered and that escape routes had been identified for the aftermath of justice delivered in the house of God. The blade was sharpened until it could part silk or flesh with equal ease, while my resolve hardened into the kind of certainty that makes difficult actions possible. The other slaves had begun to notice changes in my behavior, the calmness that comes from finally discovering one's true purpose in life. Old Samuel, who had served the Boudreaux family for 40 years, approached me with concerns that suggested he suspected something was being planned. "You got that look about you, child," he said while we prepared the Sunday clothes that the family would wear to Mass. "That look that says you done made peace with something that other folks wouldn't understand. You be careful about whatever you're contemplating." "I'm always careful," I replied, though my heart was racing with anticipation of the moment when 15 years of accumulated rage would finally find its target. Sometimes being careful means taking action that others might consider dangerous. "Just remember," Samuel said, his weathered face creased with worry, "some actions can't be taken back once they're set in motion. Make sure you're ready for whatever consequences follow." But I had already accepted whatever consequences might follow from delivering justice that was both necessary and righteous. Rose's future was more important than my own survival, and Madame Celeste's elimination was the only action that could protect my daughter from the fate that had been planned for her 10th birthday. The Spanish steel blade had been consecrated for its sacred purpose through months of planning and sharpening, transformed from a tool of creation into an instrument of divine retribution that would balance scales weighted too long against the innocent. In the house of God, where my mistress would kneel in false devotion while continuing to plan the corruption of children, justice would finally triumph over evil that had gone unpunished for far too long. Sunday, December 17th, 1856, would be remembered as the day when one slave woman chose to become an instrument of divine wrath, rather than continue witnessing the systematic destruction of everything she held sacred. The bells of St. Augustine's would ring across New Orleans, calling the faithful to worship, while summoning the sword of retribution to its appointed task. Madame Celeste had provided excellent education in cruelty and power, in the relationship between the strong and the weak, in the methods that evil uses to destroy innocence. Soon she would discover how well her student had absorbed these lessons and learn to apply them with the precision that only comes from 15 years of careful observation and perfect motivation. The house of God would become the scene of judgment that had been too long delayed, while the Spanish steel that she had provided would serve the divine purpose for which it had always been intended. Rose's innocence would be preserved through violence that was both necessary and sacred, while her mother would demonstrate what happens when evil finally encounters someone who possesses both the knowledge and the determination necessary to stop it permanently. Sunday, December 17th, 1856, dawned gray and humid over the Louisiana bayou country, with morning mist rising from the Mississippi River like incense burned for souls about to depart this world for whatever judgment awaited them in the next. I woke before sunrise as I had every morning for 15 years, but this day carried a weight of destiny that made every moment feel crystallized in time, every breath a preparation for actions that would transform both my life and my daughter's future in ways that could never be undone. The Spanish steel blade rested against my ribs, where I had secured it with strips of cloth torn from an old petticoat, its keen edge promising justice that had been too long delayed, while its presence provided the certainty that comes from finally discovering one's true purpose in life. The weight felt both foreign and familiar, like a weapon that had been waiting my entire existence for this moment, when divine retribution would finally balance scales that had been weighted against the innocent for generations. Rose stirred on her pallet beside mine, her 9-year-old face peaceful in sleep that would be her last night of complete innocence if Madame Celeste's accelerated timeline proceeded according to plan. My daughter's breathing was soft and regular, the rhythm of someone who had not yet learned to fear the dreams that would haunt her sleep once her practical education in adult cruelties began in earnest. "Mama," she whispered as consciousness returned, her green eyes opening to reveal the intelligence that made her so valuable to my mistress's clients. I had strange dreams about angels and fire. Do you think God sends messages through dreams? The question pierced my heart with its innocence, reminding me of everything that was at stake in the actions I had planned for this holy day. Rose still believed in angels and divine messages, still possessed faith that the world contained more good than evil, still trusted that adults would protect children rather than exploit them for profit and pleasure. Sometimes God speaks to us in ways we don't expect, I replied, holding her close while memorizing the feel of her small body against mine. But his messages are always about love, about protecting the innocent, about making sure that good triumphs over evil when the choice becomes necessary. The morning routine proceeded with mechanical precision as I helped prepare the Boudreau family for their weekly display of religious devotion at St. Augustine's Catholic Church. Madame Celeste's Sunday wardrobe was particularly elaborate, a confection of silk and lace that emphasized her beauty while concealing the heart that housed such terrible cruelties. "You seem unusually quiet this morning, Desiree," my mistress observed as I arranged her dark hair into the elaborate style that she preferred for public appearances. "Are you feeling well enough to attend Mass, or should I leave you here to rest while we fulfill our spiritual obligations?" The question was loaded with implications, because Madame Celeste's spiritual obligations included planning fresh torments for the slaves who served her comfort while maintaining the facade of Christian virtue that made such activities socially acceptable. Missing Sunday Mass would mean missing the perfect opportunity to deliver justice in the setting where such retribution would carry maximum symbolic weight. "I'm perfectly well, madame," I replied, my voice steady despite the adrenaline that was beginning to course through my system. "Rose and I both look forward to attending services with the family as we do every Sunday." "Excellent," she said, her emerald eyes gleaming with satisfaction at some private thought that I suspected involved my daughter's accelerated corruption timeline. "I have some important announcements to make after Mass, decisions about Rose's future that will affect both of your lives in significant ways." The casual reference to announcements about Rose's future confirmed that today was indeed the deadline I had been working toward, the moment when Madame Celeste would reveal her plans for beginning my daughter's practical education in activities that would destroy her childhood innocence, while generating profits for the woman who owned her like livestock. The carriage ride to New Orleans passed in tense silence, with the Boudreau family discussing plantation business, while Rose and I sat in the servants' section and contemplated the events that would unfold once we reached St. Augustine's Catholic Church. The Spanish steel blade pressed against my ribs with each bump and sway of the carriage wheels, a constant reminder of the justice that awaited delivery in the house of God. St. Augustine's rose from the New Orleans landscape, like a monument to divine authority, its Gothic spires reaching toward heaven, while its stone walls enclosed secrets that would soon include the violent death of one of Louisiana's most prominent plantation mistresses. The church bells were already ringing as our carriage joined the procession of vehicles delivering the city's elite to their weekly appointment with religious obligation. The interior of the church was magnificent in its appointed purpose, with stained glass windows filtering morning sunlight into patterns that painted the sanctuary in shades of gold and crimson that seemed prophetic of the blood that would soon consecrate the marble floors. The pews filled gradually with families whose wealth was built on human bondage, their prayers for divine blessing mixed with casual conversations about slave prices and crop yields. Madame Celeste took her usual position in the third row from the altar, close enough to demonstrate her family's social prominence while remaining accessible to the household slaves who stood in the designated section behind the white congregants. Rose and I assumed our customary places directly behind my mistress, close enough to observe her every movement while remaining invisible to the casual observer. The Mass began with traditional solemnity, Father Dubois leading the congregation through rituals that had been performed for centuries, while the assembled plantation elite knelt in pretended devotion to a God whose commandments they violated daily through systematic exploitation of human beings. The irony was thick as Louisiana honey, these pillars of society praying for salvation, while their wealth was built on the very sins that their religion condemned. Madame Celeste participated in every ritual with the practiced grace of someone who had perfected the art of appearing devout, while harboring thoughts that would have horrified the angels themselves. She knelt during prayers, stood for hymns, bowed her head during moments of silent reflection, all while I knew she was planning the corruption of my 9-year-old daughter with the same attention to detail that she devoted to her Sunday wardrobe. The sermon focused on forgiveness and redemption, themes that took on bitter irony when delivered to an audience that had built their prosperity on the systematic denial of both concepts to the human beings they owned like livestock. Father Dubois spoke eloquently about Christ's love for all God's children, while 300 people who were legally classified as property stood behind their owners and listened to promises of divine love that their society refused to extend to black souls. "Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy," the priest intoned from his pulpit, the words echoing through the sanctuary while Madame Celeste nodded approvingly at wisdom that she had no intention of applying to her own behavior toward those under her dominion. But I had my own interpretation of divine mercy, my own understanding of how God's justice might be delivered through instruments that appeared unlikely, but proved perfectly suited for their sacred purpose. The Spanish steel blade pressed against my ribs with each breath, warm from my body heat, and eager for the work that would balance scales weighted too long against the innocent. The moment of communion approached with the inevitability of sunrise, bringing with it the opportunity I had been planning for months, while Madame Celeste's cruelties escalated toward the point where action became not just necessary, but morally imperative. She would kneel at the altar rail to receive the body and blood of Christ, her head bowed in submission to divine authority that she had spent her lifetime defying through systematic destruction of human dignity. "Let us prepare our hearts to receive the Blessed Sacrament," Father Dubois announced, his voice carrying across the congregation like a call to spiritual arms. "Let us examine our consciences and seek forgiveness for sins that separate us from God's perfect love." The congregation began moving toward the altar in orderly procession, with the most prominent families taking their places at the communion rail while their slaves remained in the back sections to observe their owners' displays of religious devotion. But I had no intention of remaining in my assigned place during this most sacred moment of the Catholic Mass. Madame Celeste glided toward the altar with the graceful movements that had made her legendary among Louisiana society, her silk dress rustling softly as she took her place at the communion rail and knelt in the posture of humble submission that she had never truly felt toward any authority, earthly or divine. Her dark hair was arranged perfectly beneath her lace mantilla, her emerald eyes downcast in apparent prayer, her delicate hands folded in the gesture of piety that concealed a heart capable of unimaginable cruelties. I moved through the congregation like a ghost seeking vengeance, my steps silent on marble floors that would soon be consecrated with blood that had been too long contained within veins that pumped with righteous fury. The Spanish steel blade slid easily from its concealment, its sharp edge catching light from the stained glass windows as it emerged into the sacred space where justice would finally triumph over evil. "This is my body, which is given for you," Father Dubois intoned as he moved along the communion rail, placing consecrated wafers on the tongues of plantation owners who had built their wealth through the systematic consumption of human flesh and spirits. "And this is your judgment which is given for me," I whispered, as the blade found its target between Madame Celeste's shoulder blades, sliding through silk and flesh with the ease that comes from perfect sharpening and divine purpose. Her emerald eyes went wide with shock and disbelief as steel penetrated her heart from behind, her mouth opening in surprise that no sound escaped while her life poured out through the wound that 15 years of accumulated cruelty had finally earned. She tried to turn toward me, her delicate hands reaching back as if she could somehow grasp the blade that was stealing her breath, but death was already claiming her with the swift efficiency that I had planned with such careful attention to detail. "For Rose," I said, my voice barely audible above the organ music that continued to play, while the congregation slowly realized that something terrible was happening at the altar, where their social leader was collapsing in a spreading pool of blood that stained her silk dress and the marble floor beneath her knees. Madame Celeste's body pitched forward across the communion rail, her perfect hair coming loose from its elaborate arrangement, as she fell like a broken doll whose strings had been cut by divine judgment finally delivered. The consecrated wafer fell from her lips as her final breath escaped in a sound that might have been prayer or curse, but which served as punctuation for 15 years of systematic cruelty that had finally met its match in steel, guided by maternal love. The screaming began as the reality of what had happened penetrated the consciousness of plantation aristocrats who had never imagined that their human property might possess the intelligence and determination necessary to strike back against those who oppressed them. Women fainted, men shouted for assistance, children wept at the sight of blood spreading across marble that had been consecrated for the worship of a god who heard the cries of the oppressed. But I felt only peace as I stood over Madame Celeste's body, with the bloody blade still in my hand, watching the life drain from emerald eyes that had witnessed so much suffering without ever showing a trace of compassion. The woman who had elevated human torment to an art form had been reduced to cooling meat on the floor of God's house, her evil finally silenced by justice delivered through Spanish steel that she herself had provided for the purpose. "Caesar!" Master Boudreaux's voice cut through the chaos like a whip crack, his authority finally asserting itself as he pointed at me with hands that trembled with rage and disbelief. "The animal has murdered my wife!" But his words could not undo what had been accomplished in the house of God, could not resurrect the woman whose cruelties had finally earned the violent end that such evil inevitably attracts when it encounters someone with nothing left to lose. Madame Celeste was dead, Rose's future was secure, and the Spanish steel had served the divine purpose for which it had always been intended. Strong hands seized my arms as the congregation's initial shock gave way to the organized violence that followed whenever slaves dared to strike back against their oppressors. But I offered no resistance to those who bound me with ropes and chains, no protest against the justice that would inevitably follow my act of divine retribution in the most public setting possible. "Why?" Master Boudreaux demanded, his face purple with rage as he stood over his wife's body while I was dragged toward the church doors. "Why would you do this? We gave you everything, treated you like family, provided for your child's future. You provided nothing," I replied, my voice steady despite the violence that would surely follow. "You and your wife were parasites feeding on human suffering, and parasites deserve to be crushed when they threaten innocent children." The crowd parted before us as I was dragged through the church toward whatever fate awaited those who had dared to spill the blood of plantation aristocracy in the house of God itself. But behind me lay the cooling body of a woman whose evil had finally met its match, whose cruelties would never again threaten my daughter or any other child who had the misfortune to fall under her dominion. Rose's future was secure. Madame Celeste's reign of terror was ended, and the Spanish steel had served its sacred purpose with the precision that comes from divine guidance and perfect motivation. In the house of God, where my mistress had knelt in false devotion while planning the corruption of innocent children, justice had finally triumphed over evil that had been allowed to flourish for far too long. The communion wafer that had fallen from her dying lips was stained with blood that would consecrate the marble floor with a different kind of sacrifice, while the woman who had perverted her earthly power into instruments of human torture discovered what it felt like to be helpless in the hands of someone who possessed absolute authority over life and death. Divine judgment had been delivered by Spanish steel, guided by maternal love, and no earthly court could diminish the righteousness of an act that had protected the innocent by eliminating the evil that threatened to destroy them. The aftermath of Madame Celeste's death unfolded with the terrible swiftness that follows when the carefully constructed order of plantation society is challenged by violence that strikes at its very foundation. Within minutes of her body collapsing across the communion rail at St. Augustine's Catholic Church, the full weight of Louisiana's legal and social machinery began moving toward the inevitable conclusion that would serve as an example to any other slaves who might contemplate similar acts of resistance. I was dragged from the church in chains that bit into my wrists, while the congregation of plantation elite watched with expressions that mixed horror with fascination, their comfortable assumptions about the docility of their human property shattered by the sight of blood spreading across marble floors that had been consecrated for the worship of a god who heard the cries of the oppressed. Behind me, Madame Celeste's body lay in state where she had fallen, her silk dress stained crimson with the justice that had finally caught up with 15 years of systematic cruelty. The ride to the New Orleans parish prison passed in a blur of shouted curses and thrown debris, as word of the murder spread through the city streets and brought out crowds eager to witness the capture of a slave who had dared to kill her mistress in the most sacred setting imaginable. But I felt no fear as the mob pressed close to the prison wagon, no regret for actions that had secured Rose's future by eliminating the evil that had planned her corruption. "You'll hang for this, you black devil!" someone shouted from the crowd. "They'll make an example of you that every slave in Louisiana will remember." But hanging seemed a small price to pay for ensuring that my 9-year-old daughter would never experience the degradation that had defined my own existence since I was 16 years old. Rose was free from Madame Celeste's plans, protected by her mother's sacrifice from a fate that would have destroyed her innocence, while generating profits for those who saw children as commodities to be consumed by men whose desires focused on the helpless. The New Orleans Parish Prison was a monument to white authority over black resistance, its stone walls designed to contain the rage that slavery inevitably produced, while providing venues for the kinds of justice that served as warnings to other potential rebels. My cell was small and dark, furnished with straw that had absorbed the sweat and tears of countless other slaves who had been crushed by the legal machinery that protected plantation society from challenges to its fundamental assumptions. But even in that place of despair, I found peace in the knowledge that Madame Celeste would never again torment innocent children, never again force mothers to watch their daughters being prepared for degradation that masqueraded as education, never again kneel in false prayer while planning cruelties that would have horrified the angels themselves. The trial, when it came 3 weeks later, was a formality designed to provide the appearance of justice while serving the real purpose of demonstrating white authority over black resistance. The courtroom was packed with plantation owners and their families, all eager to witness the legal destruction of someone who had dared to challenge the system that provided their comfort and prosperity. Master Boudreau testified about my years of faithful service, painting a picture of ingratitude and inexplicable violence that ignored the systematic torture that had driven me to seek justice through Spanish steel, guided by divine purpose. His grief seemed genuine enough, though I suspected it was more for the loss of valuable property than for any emotional attachment to the woman who had shared his bed while pursuing activities that he had certainly known about. "She served in our household for 15 years, he said, his voice breaking with what the all-white jury interpreted as heartbreak. "We treated her like family, provided for her child's education and future, showed her kindnesses that most slaves never receive. Her attack on my beloved wife was an act of pure evil, motivated by nothing but the savage nature that civilization had failed to completely suppress. The prosecution painted me as a monster, whose crime represented the ultimate nightmare of every plantation owner in the South, the possibility that their human property might possess the intelligence and determination necessary to strike back against those who oppressed them. They described the murder in terms that emphasized its symbolic significance, the violation of sacred space that had transformed God's house into a scene of racial violence. This was not a crime of passion, the prosecutor declared, his voice rising with theatrical outrage. This was a calculated act of rebellion that strikes at the very foundation of Christian civilization in Louisiana. If we allow such violence to go unpunished, if we show mercy to someone who has demonstrated such complete contempt for the natural order that God has established, then we invite every slave in the state to follow her example. But I was given no opportunity to explain the cruelties that had driven me to seek justice through violence, no chance to describe the systematic torture that had defined my existence under Madame Celeste's authority, no platform to reveal the plans that had been made for Rose's corruption and the timeline that had made immediate action necessary to protect my daughter's innocence. The defense attorney assigned to my case was a young man who seemed genuinely disturbed by the circumstances that had led to my actions, but who was constrained by legal and social realities that made any meaningful challenge to the prosecution's narrative impossible. He did his best to suggest that years of brutal treatment might have affected my mental state, but such arguments carried little weight in a courtroom where the jury consisted entirely of men who owned human beings and had no interest in examining the moral foundations of their lifestyle. Mary is clearly a woman who has been driven to desperate action by circumstances that we may never fully understand, my attorney argued. While we cannot condone violence in any form, we must recognize that the institution of slavery sometimes produces pressures that can overwhelm even the most stable personality. But his words fell on ears that had no interest in understanding the psychological effects of systematic oppression, no curiosity about the methods that had transformed a field hand into someone capable of calculated violence in the house of God. The jury deliberated for less than an hour before returning with the verdict that everyone in the courtroom had expected from the moment I was dragged from St. Augustine's Catholic Church. "Guilty of murder in the first degree," the foreman announced, his voice carrying the authority of white justice finally asserting itself over black resistance. "We recommend death by hanging, to be carried out as soon as legally permissible." The sentence was pronounced with the solemnity that such occasions demanded, Judge Morrison's words carrying across the packed courtroom like a funeral dirge for someone whose crime had been loving her child enough to eliminate the evil that threatened to destroy her innocence. "Mary, you have been found guilty of the most heinous crime imaginable," the judge intoned, his voice heavy with the weight of legal authority. "You have murdered your mistress in the house of God, violating both human law and divine commandment in a single act of unforgivable violence. I hereby sentence you to death by hanging, to be carried out on January 15th, 1857. The date was exactly 1 month away, providing time for appeals that would never be filed, and preparations that would serve the dual purpose of allowing my spiritual advisors to prepare my soul for judgment while giving the authorities opportunity to organize a public execution that would serve as an example to any other slaves who might contemplate similar resistance. But even as I heard my death sentence pronounced, I felt only gratitude for the month that remained to me on earth. Rose was safe from Madame Celeste's plans, protected by her mother's sacrifice from degradation that would have destroyed her childhood while generating profits for those who saw children as commodities to be consumed. The Spanish steel had served its divine purpose with the precision that comes from maternal love, guided by righteous fury. The weeks that followed my sentencing were filled with visits from ministers who sought to prepare my soul for the judgment that awaited beyond the grave, men who spoke eloquently about forgiveness and redemption while serving a system that denied both concepts to the human beings it classified as property. But I needed no preparation for meeting a God who had heard the cries of the oppressed and provided the means for justice to triumph over evil. "Do you repent of your crime?" Father Dubois asked during one of his visits to my cell, the same priest who had been distributing communion when Madame Celeste received her final sacrament of Spanish steel, guided by divine justice. "I repent of nothing," I replied, my voice steady despite the proximity of death. "I served as an instrument of God's wrath against someone who had perverted her earthly power into methods of human torture. What I did was necessary and righteous." "But you took a human life," he protested, his face troubled by my lack of remorse for actions that had violated every social and religious convention that defined his worldview. "I ended an evil that was destroying innocent children," I corrected him. "Madame Celeste was planning to corrupt my 9-year-old daughter for the entertainment of men whose desires focused on helpless victims. Sometimes godly people must become instruments of divine judgment when earthly authorities fail to protect the innocent." The morning of January 15th dawned clear and cold over New Orleans, with thousands of spectators gathering in the public square to witness the execution of a slave who had dared to kill her mistress in the house of God. The scaffold had been constructed with careful attention to the symbolic message that such events were designed to convey, that challenges to the established order would be met with violence that served as warning to any others who might contemplate similar resistance. As I was led from my cell to the platform where death awaited, I felt the same peace that had settled over me when the Spanish steel found its target between Madame Celeste's shoulder blades. Rose was safe. The evil that had threatened her innocence was eliminated, and the justice that had been too long delayed had finally triumphed through methods that transcended human law and social convention. "Any last words?" the executioner asked, his voice barely audible over the crowd that had gathered to witness white authority, finally asserting itself over black resistance. "Tell Rose that her mama loved her enough to die for her freedom," I said, my voice carrying across the public square like a prayer ascending to heaven. "Tell her that sometimes love requires sacrifice that the world will never understand." The rope was rough against my neck as they positioned the noose, but it seemed a small price to pay for ensuring that my daughter would never experience the degradation that had defined my own existence for 15 years. As the trapdoor opened beneath my feet, I whispered a final prayer of thanksgiving to the God who had guided my hand and provided the Spanish steel that had served such sacred purpose in his house. This was the story of Mary of Louisiana, the enslaved woman who stabbed her mistress, Madame Celeste Boudreau, during Sunday Mass at St. Augustine's Catholic Church in New Orleans on December 17, 1856. She was executed by hanging on January 15, 1857, before a crowd of nearly 5,000 spectators who had gathered to witness the ultimate punishment for a slave who had dared to kill her owner in the house of God. Her crime was never forgotten in Louisiana plantation society, becoming a whispered reminder that even the most carefully controlled human property might possess the intelligence and determination necessary to strike back against those who oppressed them. Her daughter Rose was eventually sold to a family in Texas, where she grew up knowing only that her mother had died, protecting her from unspecified dangers. The Spanish steel blade that had served as the instrument of divine justice was displayed in the New Orleans courthouse as evidence of the violence that slavery could produce when pushed beyond the breaking point. Mary's final words about love requiring sacrifice became part of slave folklore throughout Louisiana, passed down through generations as a reminder that some bonds transcend even death itself when protecting the innocent becomes more important than preserving one's own life. The echoes of Mary's righteous fury resonate through time, a testament to maternal love that defied every earthly power. If these untold stories of sacrifice and divine justice stir your soul, join our community. Subscribe to our channel to uncover more hidden truths from the shadows of American slavery. Your support helps us keep these powerful narratives alive, ensuring that the voices of those who chose death over witnessing their children's destruction will never be forgotten.